The origins of Rome. To truly understand how Rome came to dominate the ancient world, we must first start at the beginning. Before the eternal city was ever clad in marble and stone, Rome was just an insignificant little settlement on the banks of the river Tiber. Human activity in the region actually dates back to around 1700 BC. But our story doesn't begin until the late 8th century, when the various settlements, tribes, and villages that already called the Capitoline Hill their home unified, becoming a city-state and adopting the name Rome. But as the city grew and developed, so too did the ideas and questions that surrounded its founding. Before long, Rome had adopted a new story, the founding myth of Romulus and Remus. Numerous versions of the tale exist, but the most popular tells the story of the twin brothers, divine in spirit yet mortal in flesh, who had been abandoned along the banks of the river Tiber and left to die on the wishes of the nearby king of Alba Longa. Death would no doubt have taken the infants, had a she-wolf not rescued and nursed them back to health, keeping them alive long enough to be discovered by a nearby shepherd who took the boys in as his own. As they grew into men, they discovered their royal origins and set out to right the wrongs which had been made against them. They traveled to Alba Longa and deposed the king, restoring order to the ancient city once more. Having achieved their destinies, the brothers set out to build their own city, returning to the banks of the Tiber where they had tasted death all those years before. But things took a left turn when Romulus and Remus disagreed on what name this new city would take. In the end, Romulus killed his brother and founded the new city atop the Palatine Hill on the 21st of April 753 BC. He gave it to his name, the city of Romulus, the city of Rome. The Roman Kingdom. What came next was the birth of the Roman Kingdom, ruled by Rome's 7 legendary kings. It began with the mythical Romulus, who laid the foundations of Roman rule by founding the Senate, erecting Rome's first border wall, and organizing the city into 3 distinct groups, for tax and military purposes. He was succeeded by Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, and a man who was revered by all for his great discipline and piety. His death in 672 BC ended a 43-year-long reign, the longest of all of the 7 kings of Rome. His successor and the 3rd king of Rome was a man named Tullus Hostilius, a bloodthirsty individual who sought conflict and war with the nearby Latin tribes. He is mostly remembered for 2 things, the destruction of Alba Longa and the construction of the Curia Hostilia, the original Roman Senate house. He would rule for 32 years before his death in 640 BC. Legend has it Hostilius was struck by a bolt of lightning sent down by the god Jupiter, who had grown unhappy at the Roman king's lack of piety. Other sources, though, put him as having died from plague, which is probably more likely. The 4th king of Rome was Ancus Marcius, elected to the throne in 640 BC. He continued to expand Rome's territories outwards, absorbing the town of Jancilium and giving his city direct influence over the river Tiber for the first time in its history. He died of natural causes in 616 BC and was succeeded by the 5th king of Rome, a man named Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. King Priscus continued to fight wars against the Latin, Sabine, and Etruscan people, while also overseeing a number of construction projects in the city itself. Most iconic of these projects was the Circus Maximus, the first and largest stadium built in Rome with a capacity of over 150,000 people. To put that into perspective, the largest modern sports stadium today, India's Modi Stadium, built in 2020, seats just 132,000 people. Rome's 5th king met a grisly death in 578, murdered by the sons of his predecessor as he walked through the streets of Rome. No king had ever faced such a threat, and the ensuing confusion rattled the ruling class. The throne was eventually given to his son-in-law, Servius Tullius. Tullius was the first Roman king to take power without the Senate's vote. a move which would forever taint him in their eyes. And as the son of a former slave, his pedigree and ruling ability was immediately called into question, and he lacked the support of the upper classes. But despite the illegality of his position, Rome's sixth king led the city through a period of immense peace and prosperity. He continued to expand Rome's borders, founded a number of major religious festivals, and oversaw the first radical reformation of Rome's political system after he expanded the Roman franchise and gave vast swaths of lower-class people full Roman citizenship. He would eventually meet a cruel fate, thrown down the steps of the Senate House by his own son-in-law and left to die on the streets of his city. The laurel crown, still tainted with the old king's blood, came to rest on the head of his assassin. With that, the seventh and final king of Rome came to rule. Lucius Tarquinius, the last king of Rome. Tarquinius ruled with an iron fist, staining the streets of Rome with blood as he consolidated his position on the throne. He began with a series of purges against the senatorial elite, meant to rid the institution of any supporters of the old regime. He had a number of leading statesmen and aristocrats put to death, which destabilized much of the internal political machine of Rome almost overnight. He also refused to give the former Tullius a proper burial, angering the general population who had loved their former king and respected his divine position on the throne. Away from the city, Tarquinius's ruthlessness continued, as he attempted to reinforce Roman dominance on the nearby Latin villages, a decision that would ultimately bankrupt the treasury and further destabilize the city in chaos. Before long, the people had had enough. Having grown wary of their king and his countless abuses of power, a number of Roman senators, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, banded together and promised to overthrow the king. A meeting of the Roman Comitia was held, and with the blessing of the people of Rome, the aristocracy declared the reign of King Tarquinius to be over in 509 BC, expelling the royal family from the city and forcing the king into exile. A revolution had begun. Rome had shed the chains of monarchy and stepped forward into a new age. The kingdom of Rome was no more. The Roman Republic had been born. Birth of the Roman Republic. With the king gone, the Comitia Centuriata decided to elect 2 consuls to hold joint power over the city of Rome and its people. The idea was simple. The powers previously held by the king would be split and shared between 2 men, each with the right to veto the other. This would in theory allow the consuls to keep one another in check and reduce any one man's ability to abuse his position and amass total power. Lucius Junius Brutus, the head of the former king's bodyguard, and Lucius Collatinus, a Roman general, were both chosen to be the first co-consuls of Rome's new republic. They would oversee a period known as the Roman-Etruscan War, where the former king Tarquinius would make numerous attempts to retake the city and install himself as king of Rome once again. It was a bloody and brutal baptism of fire for the new republic. They were immediately faced with the Tarquinian conspiracy, which saw a number of high-profile Roman senators and elites executed for their perceived allegiances to the old king. This was followed by the Battle of Silva Arcia in 509 BC, as Rome's Republican forces faced off against the old king's army. It was a costly engagement, which saw Rome emerge victorious, but only after sustaining heavy losses and losing their co-consul, Brutus, to the fighting. Just a year later, the battle-weary and undermanned Romans faced the threat of another invasion, this time along the banks of the river Tiber. Forced to scramble, her armies moved to defend the only bridge that crossed into the city, beginning the siege of Rome. Both sides engaged in espionage, sabotage, and seemingly endless negotiations. Eventually, though, a peace was reached and the Etruscan-Roman War was over. The Etruscan king Lars Porsena sent his ambassadors into the city one last time, asking for the restoration of Tarquinius to the throne. But the Senate's response was as firm as it had ever been. They told the Etruscan king that they would never reinstate their old ruler, and that out of respect for their new republic, he should stop asking. So he did. In 507 BC, Lucius Tarquinius, the 7th king of Rome, was sent into exile once again, ending the Roman monarchy and securing the future of the new Roman Republic. Early wars of expansion. Rome defined its existence in the 100 years that followed by embarking a series of major wars of expansion. They gained total dominance in Latium after the Battle of Lake Regillus in 496 BC. And with the Battle of Aricia a year later, her southern borders were pushed further than they had ever been before. Next, they expanded their reach into the Apennine Mountains, securing 2 decisive victories at Mount Augustus and then at Corbio in 446 BC. By 426, Rome had effectively conquered all of its immediate Etruscan and Latin neighbors. It was, without question, the most powerful city in central Italy. Conflict of the Orders. But away from all the successes of the battlefield, Rome had a growing problem. The early republic was gripped by an ongoing political struggle between the 2 social classes of Rome, the plebeians and the patricians. Made up of a closed group of 50 families, Rome's aristocratic patricians held a complete monopoly over the most sought-after and influential positions in society. They were diplomats, senators, and generals. Meanwhile, the common plebeians had little political power, and by law were denied access to high religious or civil office. But they weren't completely helpless. Plebeians made up the majority of Rome's population, and as a result were the backbone of her economy. These laborers, traders, and artisans quickly realized they could lobby for change simply by withdrawing their labor from the city, and withdraw it they did, protesting their treatment as second-class citizens in 495 BC, and demanding equal rights under Roman law in what would come to be known as the Secessio Plebis. As Rome was busy fighting a war with the Sabines, the patrician class had little choice but to grant the plebs their demands, and the office of the plebeian tribune was formed shortly after. It gave plebs greater access to Roman politics and allowed them to propose legislation that only applied to them and elect their own tribunes to represent them in the Senate. This conflict of class would last until 287 BC, during which time 4 other plebeian withdrawals would take place, each time protesting their right to a greater involvement in government and society. By the 5th and final Secessio Plebis, almost every barrier that previously excluded them had been removed. They now had access to all religious and civil offices, and the right to create laws that applied to every citizen, not just the lower classes. It was a conflict that would come to define Rome for centuries after. But for now, the people were satiated. The Republic was once again free to turn its attention outwards, setting its sights on the rest of the Italian peninsula. The Conquest of Italy. Rome's position as the hegemonic power in Latium directly led to the outbreak of war in 340 BC. Independent cities took up arms against the Romans in an effort to maintain their independence and stop Roman expansion. The Latin War was a short-lived conflict, and in 338 BC, Rome had emerged as the total master of central Italy. The following decades were spent expanding Rome's northern and southern frontiers. The Samnite Wars, 343 to 290 BC, gave the Eternal City new territories in the southern Apennine Mountains, while in the north, the last vestiges of Etruscan power were finally defeated at the Battle of Populonia in 282 BC. For the longest time now, Rome had been somewhat lucky. Despite its aggressive conquest of the Italian peninsula, the Republic had so far been able to avoid major conflicts with the other Mediterranean superpowers of its day. But by the early 3rd century BC, that was about to change. In 280 BC, Rome entered into a seemingly routine war against the southern city of Tarentum, but quickly found its army pushed to the brink when Tarentum called on Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, for aid. The Greek king Pyrrhus had long seen Rome as a threat to his own growing Mediterranean empire, and believed Tarentum's pleas for help would provide the perfect opportunity to destroy a regional rival and gain a foothold on the Italian peninsula. Pyrrhus's war elephants struck fear into the hearts of the Roman army as he was able to secure a number of early victories in the south near the port of Tarentum. His best hope of victory was to reach the Roman capital before the rest of the Republic's army could be recalled from the northern front. But King Pyrrhus would have no such luck. Rome's war in the north ended a year later, and the Greek king was quickly overwhelmed by a wave of fresh, battle-hardened soldiers ready to defend their city to the death. In 275 BC, King Pyrrhus was defeated at the Battle of Beneventum and forced to withdraw from the peninsula entirely, leaving only a small garrison at Tarentum from which to wage future wars from. He died a year later fighting the Spartans at home, ending the Pyrrhic Wars. With this, Rome had become the master of Italy. Her influence spread from the foothills of the Alps to the shores of the Ionian Sea, and the ancient world held its breath as a new superpower took its place in history. The Punic Wars. The Pyrrhic Wars had given Rome a taste of what was to come. As the Republic continued to expand into the Mediterranean, it was no doubt going to upset some of its other, larger powers in the region. Something it did in 264 BC with the invasion of Sicily. You see, the island belonged to Carthage, a North African empire that had enjoyed almost unopposed power in the region for centuries already. They dominated from the Straits of Gibraltar to the borders of Egypt, and since the 5th century BC had claimed dominion over Sicily. The arrival of Roman soldiers on the island sparked the Punic Wars, a conflict that would come to define the Republic forever. Spanning 118 years, it cost the lives of millions and gave rise to some of the most dramatic moments in Rome's history. Beginning with the Battle of Messina in 264, the First Punic War raged for 23 years on both land and sea, ending in a decisive Roman victory and the annexation of Sicily into the Republic. It was followed by the Second Punic War, fought between 220 and 200 BC. Often the best remembered of the three wars, it was here that the Carthaginian general Hannibal led his army through the impassable Alps, launching a destructive campaign right into the heart of Rome's territories. War elephants marched once again through the Roman countryside as Hannibal inflicted heavy casualties on a Roman army that was scrambling to respond. In 216 BC, the new consuls mustered the biggest land army Rome had ever seen, hoping to defeat the Carthaginian threat once and for all. 80,000 men marched to the eastern edge of the peninsula, outnumbering their Carthaginian enemy 2-1. But despite their numerical superiority, Hannibal crushed the Roman army, inflicting on them the single largest defeat in all of Roman history. Of the 80,000 men who marched to Apulia, only 14,500 would return home. Hannibal was eventually defeated by the Roman commander Africanus the Elder, and by the Third Punic War of 149 BC, Rome had pretty much established its dominance over her Mediterranean rival, not only occupying Carthage, but completely destroying it in 146 BC. Expansion across the Mediterranean. With Carthage defeated, no other power in the Mediterranean could stand up to Rome's aggressive expansion. By 133 BC, the Republic had defeated the Achaean League, bringing Greece and Ionia into Roman administration. This was followed by the conquest of Hispania, Cisalpine Gaul, and the Adriatic coastline of modern-day Croatia and Albania. But while Rome's planners and leaders continued to train their eyes to the horizon, they had become blind to a growing threat at home. Poisoned by ambition, the 1st century BC marked a period of Roman history defined almost entirely by civil war and social unrest. The end of the Republic was near as a cloud of change blew over Rome. The Social War. In 91 BC, the Social War broke out, marking the first time open conflict was had between Rome and her non-Roman allies. You see, despite their assimilation into the Republic centuries before, people like the Sabines, Etruscans, and other Latins were still not considered full Roman citizens. They lacked the right to a vote. They were exempt from being given new land by state, and despite their role in the Roman army, they were excluded from their share of the spoils of conquest. So in 91 BC, towns across the peninsula revolted, demanding either equal treatment under Roman law or their total freedom. Rome was able to avoid a complete military defeat by conceding the rebels' main points, and enacting the Lex Julia, a law which granted those who lay down their arms full Roman citizenship, tripling the population of Rome overnight. But concessions alone could not fix the cracks in the Republic, and the 1st century BC would continue to be a time of great social upheaval and instability. The social war would prove to be the first in a long series of conflicts of class that would eventually cripple the Republic to its core. The Marian-Sullan Civil War. The first of these pseudo-class struggles was the Marian-Sullan Civil War, fought between 88 and 82 BC. This was a conflict that had long been brewing, allowed to fester in the dank underbelly of Rome's Senate buildings and forums, as two of the city's most powerful men allowed personal rivalry to consume the Republic and plunge it into civil war. The conflict earned its name for the two men who fought it. One was Cornelius Sulla, a Roman general and statesman, famed for his military success and innovative approach to warfare. The other was Gaius Marius, another of Rome's general politician class, who held the unique distinction of having been elected to the consulship an unprecedented 7 times already. Their rivalry began during the Jugurthine War, 1112 to 106 BC, where a young Sulla rose to prominence by capturing the Numidian king Jugurtha and putting an end to the conflict. But before victory wreaths could be laid on the young general's head, his superior, Gaius Marius, took credit for the attack and was hailed as a hero for his actions back in Rome. Sulla was furious, but there was little he could do against the more senior Marius, and the young statesman returned to the capital, forced to bide his time. Luckily for him, Rome was awash with tension, and he would soon be given his chance at revenge. Following on from the social war, Sulla and Marius found themselves on opposite ends of the Roman political spectrum. Sulla was an optimate, a firm supporter of senatorial supremacy, while Marius belonged to the growing populares, populist leaders who advocated for reform designed to limit the power of the Senate and return it to the people. Tension in the capital eventually boiled over as war broke out in 88 BC. With Sulla and Marius at the heads of their respective factions. It was the first major civil war of the Republic, with fighting across all Rome's territories. Control seesawed from one man to another, and after 6 years of bloody and brutal fighting, Sulla and his men were able to defeat Marian's army at the Battle of the Colline Gate, just outside Rome, ending the Marian-Sullan Civil War for good. In its wake, Sulla established the new Sullan Republic and revived the office of the dictator, assuming total emergency powers. Victorious, Sulla had become the first man in Roman history since the demigod King Romulus to take power of Rome through force alone. And while he eventually relinquished control peacefully, his actions set a precedent that would forever change Rome and her republic. The rise of the first Triumvirate. It was in the years that followed that a number of notable Roman leaders would rise through the ranks and earn acclaim for their ability. There was Pompey, a general and Roman statesman who earned fame for his quashing of anti-Sullan forces in Hispania during the Praetorian War of 80 to 72 BC. Then there was Crassus, another Roman general who was successful during the Third Servile War that ravaged large parts of central Italy and temporarily destabilized much of the Roman slave trade. Another important figure of the Sullan Republic was a young statesman by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar. Far removed from the exceptional military achievements of his contemporaries, Caesar rose to prominence through his political connections and savvy statesmanship, finally winning the consulship in 59 BC. But on his way there, the young statesman had become appalled at the state of Rome's political systems. The Republic had become bogged down by the weight of its imperial ambitions. The central government was weak and commanded zero power in the capital, allowing corruption to thrive and the status quo to be maintained by a small group of aristocrats who had little incentive to change a system that had made them all so rich. But Caesar was smart. He knew that he alone could not change anything. so he developed a plan. In 60 BC, he entered into a secret political alliance with Pompey and Crassus, two of the most powerful men in Rome at the time, founding the first Triumvirate. Together, they quietly set about seizing control of the Senate, using their combined influence to make changes they thought best suited the now crumbling republic. It was an ambitious and noble undertaking, designed to rescue Rome and return it to its former glory. But there was just one problem. The vision of a rescued Rome differed man to man, and the Triumvirate, while successful at first, quickly began to fall apart as personalities clashed and power changed hands. The fall of the First Triumvirate. The fall of the First Triumvirate began in 58 BC when Caesar was given the command of a legion in Gaul. He had been desperate for military glory, and over the next 6 years would engage the Gallic tribes of northwestern Europe in a brutal campaign that earned him renown through the Republic for his skill on the battlefield and tactical genius. But not everyone was pleased with the Gallic general's successes. Pompey and Crassus could see that their ally was beginning to amass power far greater than anything they had. With every Senate meeting, the shadow of Caesar appeared to loom larger, threatening to undo everything their alliance had worked to achieve. In 53 BC, Crassus led an invasion into Parthia, hoping to mimic the military victories of Caesar and Pompey and strengthen his own image in the process. But just a few weeks into the campaign, Crassus and his army were surrounded at the Battle of Carrhae. His death officially marked the end of the First Triumvirate. The following year, Caesar was victorious at the legendary Battle of Alesia, defeating a combined Gallic army to conquer Gaul once and for all. With Crassus dead and Pompey an increasingly unpopular senatorial figure, Caesar stood alone, more powerful and influential than ever before. So he sought to occupy Rome's most senior position once again. In 50 BC, he ran for the consulship to great controversy. You see, one of the first laws implemented by Sulla after his rebellion was the need for anyone who wished to stand for the consulship to be in Rome, and not at the head of any provincial army. But Caesar, who was currently in Gaul and commanding one of the largest and fiercest Roman armies the Republic had ever seen, didn't care. He ran for the consulship anyway, and found his path blocked by an old friend. Pompey could not let Caesar take control. With neither man prepared to back down, the egos of both Caesar and Pompey inadvertently dragged Rome once again into conflict. Caesar's civil war had begun. Caesar's Civil War. On the 10th of January 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon into Italy at the head of a great army, violating Roman law and making himself an enemy of the Republic. The Senate hastily chose Pompey as their leader, passing to him dictatorial powers in the hopes he could stop Caesar and end the fighting soon. But Caesar's army was well trained and highly loyal to their commander, marching through the Roman countryside with rapid pace. Fearing for their safety and unable to raise an army quick enough, Pompey and the Senate fled to Greece. Caesar entered the city unopposed, but he knew his presence alone in the capital meant nothing if Pompey was still out there. So he took his troops to Greece, where he finally faced his old friend in combat. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar defeated Pompey's army and forced the Roman dictator to flee to Egypt, where he was murdered by the Ptolemaic soldiers stationed there loyal to Caesar. Pompey's death did not end the civil war, though, and while Caesar had lost 1/3 of his army already, he continued to push on, defeating the remaining Pompeian army at the Battle of Thapsus in North Africa, and then again in Hispania at the Battle of Munda. With that, Caesar had won. Rome was his. The Dictatorship of Julius Caesar. A triumphant Caesar returned to the capital and declared himself dictator, just as Sulla had 40 years before him. Like Sulla, Caesar did so with the promise that he would stabilize Rome and return the Republic to its former glory. But straight away, there were those in the Senate who could tell things were different. Stability for Caesar meant control. Stability of Caesar meant total power. Instead of the usual year-long term, Caesar's dictatorship lasted 10 years. during which time he enacted a series of radical constitutional reforms that were designed to increase his personal power and limit the power of the already established political institutions of Rome. Under his watch, the Senate was diluted of influence, the tribune undermined by his lifetime membership, and the censor totally absorbed into his own personal office. This made the dictator a lot of powerful enemies. In 44 BC, Caesar made a decision that would spell his downfall when he officially crowned himself dictator for life, fully and openly embracing his position as the most powerful man in Rome. That was the final straw. Many in the Senate saw this as a blatant and obvious perversion of Rome's republican ideals, a threat to their way of life, and an unraveling of everything they had built since the expulsion of the king almost 500 years before. And so, a plan to save the Republic was hatched. Led by Gaius Cassius and Marcus Brutus, they devised a plot to assassinate the dictator and restore order to the Roman Republic. The tides of March were here, and they had not yet left. The assassination of Julius Caesar. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, Caesar awoke from a nightmare he'd been having. Drenched in sweat, he turned to his sleeping wife for comfort, recounting how the roof of the Senate building had collapsed in on him in his dream. Calpurnia worried for her husband and urged him to take the day off and rest. Caesar agreed, sending a messenger to tell the other senators of his planned absence from the meetings of the day. But when news reached Brutus, he personally rushed to Caesar's home in an attempt to change the dictator's mind. Caesar was reluctant, but his old friend persisted, and together they set off for the day's meetings. The Roman Senate had a habit of using different buildings to host their meetings throughout the city, and on this occasion, the meeting was to take place at the Curia Pompeo, a large house constructed by Caesar's old rival, Pompey, during his years as consul. In the center of the room, a large statue of the late general towered over everyone. Caesar took his place, sitting down on a lone chair at the foot of Pompey's bust. The conspirators' plans had worked. Rising from their seats, they brandished hidden daggers and surrounded Caesar. 60 conspirators had agreed each to stab the dictator once, all implicating themselves in the murder and restoration of the Roman Republic. In the end, Caesar was stabbed just 23 times. The final blow came from his old friend and the man who had pulled him from his bed that same morning. "Brute," the dictator muttered as he clutched at his wounds, his toga stained red. Brutus looked down at the face of his old mentor. Surely, he thought, the Republic was saved. Pandemonium broke out as those not involved panicked and feared they might be next, rushing the exit and causing a stampede. In seconds, the Curia Pompeo was empty, and Caesar's body lay alone at the foot of Pompey's statue. It would remain there for hours before slaves were sent in to quietly retrieve it. The Second Triumvirate. It did not take long for Brutus to realize that his hopes of a rescued republic were entirely misplaced. For the third time in a century, Rome was plunged into civil war. The immediate aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar was a capital in total disarray. Citizens rioted in the streets. Temples and market stalls were looted and set alight as law and order collapsed. The governing bodies of Rome, which had been stripped of their power and prestige by the old dictator, were incapable of stopping this. It was under this internal crisis that 3 men closest to Caesar hastily formed a new alliance known as the Second Triumvirate. Made up of Caesar's co-consul, Mark Antony, his adopted son Octavian, and master of the horse, Lepidus, the Second Triumvirate promised to restore peace and order to the capital, and bring the traitors to justice. The conspirators had planned everything, except for what to do after they'd killed Caesar. Assuming they would be welcomed as liberators, they were surprised when Rome broke out in riot, fleeing to Greece to avoid retaliation. 2 years later, in 42 BC, the Second Triumvirate defeated a combined conspirator army at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia, ending their revolt. Rome was, for the moment, satiated once more. Together, the 3 men decided that the powers previously held by the dictator would be split between them, with each given their own regions of the Republic to administer. Mark Antony held the East. Octavian controlled Rome and the West, while Lepidus could have the scraps that remained in North Africa. And while history seldom repeats, it often rhymes, as the Second Triumvirate was, in many ways, similar to the first. Fragile, weak, and now lacking a common enemy, the old rivalries that underpinned their alliance resurfaced and threatened to undo everything they had fought for. The fall of the Roman Republic. During the restoration of peace, Mark Antony had done a great job positioning himself as Caesar's successor. Power would have eventually been his had it not been for Caesar's funeral. During a reading of the late dictator's will, it was revealed that Caesar had actually named his son, Octavian, as his heir, delegitimizing Mark Antony in the eyes of Caesar's supporters. This caused both Antony and Octavian to embark on a secret campaign to topple the other and take total control of Rome. Lepidus was the first casualty of this new war, losing his lands and titles to Octavian before being forced into exile in Circea, modern-day Russia. Sensing that his old master's son was gaining ground, Antony moved to consolidate his power base in Egypt. The powerful Ptolemaic kingdom offered the general a strong place with which to wage a war against the Republic, and while there, he aligned himself closely with the Egyptian royal family, falling in love with Caesar's old lover, Cleopatra. But Octavian could see right through his father's lieutenant. In 32 BC, he declared war on the Egyptian queen and her kingdom, accusing her of corrupting Antony and conspiring against Rome. Antony and his fleet were defeated at Actium a year later, and he was forced to flee with his lover to Alexandria, where together they committed suicide as Rome's armies closed in around them. A 32-year-old Octavian sailed back to Rome victorious. At his feet lay a republic in ruins that he alone would resuscitate, changing it forever. The birth of the Roman Empire. Remembering how the Senate had turned on Caesar, Octavian knew that if he wanted total control, he would have to consolidate his power in a wholly different way. Autocracy would have to be concealed, power gained subtly. It was a risk, but one Octavian was willing to take. To help disguise his control, Octavian allowed many of the Republic's old institutions to function as they had before. He ruled on the promise that he could return Rome to its former glory and do away with the instability that had gripped the Republic in the 1st century BC. For that, many support him. He also refused to declare himself dictator, as Caesar and Sulla had, and instead gained executive power through a string of elections to the consulship, further disguising his consolidation of power. Using the newly acquired Egyptian treasuries, Octavian embarked on a mission to rebuild Rome. He invested heavily on infrastructure, rebuilding the Theater of Pompey, completing Caesar's Forum, and beginning the monumental task that would eventually become Rome's renowned network of roads. He also went on to found the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit of personal bodyguards and intelligence agents that would become enshrined in a Roman legend over the next centuries, answering directly to the Emperor of Rome himself. But that's the thing. Octavian wasn't an emperor, not yet. Octavian continued to hide his consolidations, creating a new office of rule known as the Principate, or First Citizen. As Principate, he had total control, but he maintained the illusion that the former offices of the Republic still ruled, allowing his countrymen to believe that Rome was still governed by the will of the people and not by the will of a single man. On the 16th of January 27 BC, though, this changed. As Rome's first citizen, Octavian had the Senate in his pocket, the unbridled love of the people, and enough prestige to directly influence any appointments made to the consulship and metropolitan offices of Rome. He was without question Rome's new emperor in all but name. So, he decided to make it official. Octavian adopted the name Augustus, drawing on its religious and mythical connotations to help emphasize his authority. Hence, it would come to be the title all future emperors of Rome adopted, and historians date this, the day Augustus officially came to rule, as the day the Roman Empire began. Pax Romana. Now ruled by one man, Rome began the long and laborious challenge of rebuilding all that had been destroyed. This was by no means easy, as the strife which gripped the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC had not only brought damage to the city itself, but left a scar on the psyche of its inhabitants too. Countless civil wars had eroded the people's trust in the state, and many still remembered the bloody and ruthless persecutions which had culled, seemingly at random, those in their communities who dared involve themselves with politics. Unease, fear, and anxiety perforated throughout Roman society. Simply put, Emperor Augustus gave a tired and weary population what they wanted: peace and prosperity. In 27 AD, Augustus officially declared to thronging crowds gathered in the Forum that Rome had entered into a period of its existence called the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. For the next 200 years, the new Roman Empire would be free from major internal conflict and external strife, as her borders were expanded, cities rebuilt, and treasuries stuffed. It would be the first and last time Rome ever experienced such a thing. Augustus's new Roman army. In this new age of peace, Augustus continued reforming Rome's key institutions, eventually setting his sights on her most revered, the army. To him, much of the civil instability of the last century had been because of the bloated and self-serving nature of Rome's armed forces. They had become too powerful, too opportunistic, and too easily swayed with the promise of gold and land. So, the army was brought to heel, undergoing major reform designed to help the new emperor maintain a secure grasp on his new position. He began by trimming the fat. Rome's 50 legions were cut down to just 28, and left to permanently stand. Prior to this, Rome did not have a permanent standing army, and instead relied on senatorial approval to call on its reserves during times of war. Augustus changed this, creating a permanent force which now pledged its allegiance directly to him, a move which centralized power and stripped opportunistic senators of their ability to raise armies with which to rebel, as Caesar and Sulla had before. He was also the first Roman ruler to clearly establish official rates of pay, years of service, and pensions, professionalizing the army to meet the changing demands of its global empire. Equipment was standardized and provided by the Senate, meaning soldiers were no longer responsible for sourcing their own gear. This led to the mass adoption of chainmail, iron swords, and a new legionnaire style of helmet, replacing the old coolest style that had been in use since 300 BC. These reforms proved massively successful as Rome's new army, now free from civil war, was once again able to turn its attention outwards, ready to resume its conquest of the ancient world. The Varian disaster. By 8 AD, the instability of the last century had given way to unquestioned Roman hegemony. From Gaul to the Levant, Rome's armies marched and reconquered all they had lost during the years of civil unrest, and seemed an unstoppable force, made better by Augustus's reforms. But along the murky fringes of her northernmost border, where the river Rhine split the civilized from the uncivilized, Rome and her armies were in for a surprise. The September mist clung to the trees as Roman general Publius Varus led his army through the formidable Teutoburg forest. He had come to Germania with 3 full legions, intent on subduing the troublesome Germanic tribes that had been raided and pillaged with impunity along Rome's Germanic border. That summer's campaign had been a slow one, with Varus forced to return to his winter headquarters having made minimal gains in the region. Heavy rain beat down on the tired bodies of legionnaires, and the narrow snaking path they followed through the dense vegetation caused the army to become spread out and disorganized. It was in these shadows that the Bructeri waited. They had fought the Romans before and knew that victory against this larger foe could be had, as long as they were patient. Commanding this tribal army was Arminius, a Germanic prince, born to the Cherusci tribe who had gained Roman citizenship and risen through the ranks, learning from the Roman scholars and training under Roman generals. He was disliked by the Senate, who saw him as a barbarian unfit to lead Roman men to war, but the army respected him for his wisdom and virtue. Arminius even became a close friend of Publius Varus prior to his campaign in Germania, accompanying him across the Rhine in 9 AD. Arminius, however, saw through the hypocrisy of the empire. Despite their assimilation into Roman life, his people were second-rate citizens, mistreated and oppressed by their patrician overlords as the young gave their lives, and the old died in poverty and squalor. Arminius would not let the rest of Germania succumb to a similar fate. He convinced Varus to lead his men through the Teutoburg forest, promising them that they would reach their winter encampment sooner than if they went around. Varus listened, trusting his old friend, but quickly found his supply lines under attack, and his men exhausted and scared. General Varus had no choice but to force march through the night and get his men out of there as soon as possible. Panic was creeping into the Roman army. At the foot of Calchrease Hill, where the path narrowed, Arminius and his army lay in wait. They had dug a long trench to block the road ahead, and repurposed the earth to build walls along the roadside, shielding them from view. When the Roman army came to the clearing, they attempted to storm these earthen walls but were repelled. As panic fully set in, the highest-ranking officer next to Varus fled the battle, abandoning his troops and signaling to the Germanic warriors that now was the time to strike. An estimated 18,000 tribesmen descended onto the clearing of Calchrease Hill, slaughtering the confused Roman army where it stood. 22,000 Roman soldiers had entered the forest of Teutoburg that September. Less than 1,000 emerged. Varus committed suicide alongside most of the officer class, while those lucky enough to have survived the attack were impressed into slavery. It was the single largest defeat in the empire's history, and had a profound impact on the people back home. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD forever changed how Rome approached its northern border. Never again would the empire attempt to exert direct control north of the Rhine, as the Germanic tribes succeeded in doing what no other group had been able to do before. They stopped the advance of Rome. Literature in the early Roman Empire. But Teutoburg did little to halt the Great Peace from continuing, and over the next decade, Roman life flourished. Not just economically, but culturally too, as a generation of writers and poets lived within her walls, and redefined Western literature with every stroke and line. There was Titus Livius, or Livy, who rose to prominence during the reign of Emperor Augustus, and is remembered today for authoring the first complete history of Rome and her peoples. It encompassed 142 books, beginning in 753 BC and ended in 9 BC during his own lifetime, and gave to the world the most extensive story of Rome the world had ever seen. Alongside him was Ovid, a master poet famed for his technical prowess and literary skill. His seminal work, The Metamorphoses, explored the old Greek myths, and quickly became one of the best-selling poems of the age. He too attracted the attention of Augustus, but for reasons far less savory, as he was banished to Tomis on the Black Sea in 8 AD for his suspected role in the adultery of Augustus's granddaughter. Chief among the writers and poets of Rome, and at the forefront of this literary renaissance, was Virgil, a man of great esteem who rose from his place in the peasantry and died having earned the title of greatest Roman poet. His magnum opus, the Aeneid, told the story of Aeneas, a Trojan soldier who fled from Troy during its collapse and settled in Italy, eventually becoming the ancestor to Rome's founders Romulus and Remus. This 12-book epic would go down in history as one of the greatest Latin works of fiction ever written, but it almost never existed. Virgil had intended to burn it shortly before his death, as it was technically unfinished, but fell ill in 19 BC and died at the harbor of Brundisium suddenly and without warning. This left the manuscript untouched and unburned. That's when Augustus stepped in. He ordered Virgil's literary executors hand over the poem, publishing it himself against the dead wordsmith's wishes. These men were the voices of their age, whose stanzas outlived even the empires from which they wrote from. The death of Augustus. And Augustus didn't stop here. Alongside the restoration of peace and order, the first emperor of Rome secured his nation's future by establishing Rome's first imperial dynasty, the Julian-Claudian line. This was a complicated procedure, as Augustus knew he could not simply just appoint his successor outright. Any heir would have to slowly and incrementally gain the powers of the Principate alongside him, in an undramatic and subtle fashion, almost as he had, so as not to stir senatorial fears of the monarchy. The man he eventually chose was his stepson, Tiberius, one of the most capable Roman generals of the time. He ruled alongside his father as co-emperor until the death of Augustus in 14 AD. Addressing his people one last time, an aging Augustus proclaimed to Rome, "I found the city built of bricks. I leave her clothed in marble," ushering in a new age, the age of Tiberius.